On December 12, 2024, in Miami, Florida, it was a warm and quiet evening. The streets, almost deserted, seemed to be enjoying the peace before the hustle and bustle of the holiday season. But somewhere along the main avenue, the screeching of metal on the pavement shattered the calm, signaling that something was wrong. A red sedan, missing one tire and swaying from side to side, was making its way forward as if it had just participated in a wrestling match with a truck. Behind the wheel was a woman in an expensive evening gown, her hair flowing elegantly, but her eyes glazed over and unfocused. She stopped abruptly when the traffic light flickered, accompanied by the shrill sound of a siren. Officer Daniels stepped out of his patrol car, the flashing lights reflecting off the road. He looked at the vehicle as though it were a surreal piece of art, one tire completely missing, the front bumper torn apart, and sparks still flying from the rim. "Ma'am, do you know why we asked you to stop?" Officer Daniels inquired, his stern gaze betraying curiosity. The woman smiled, wobbling slightly as she got out of the car. "Me? What's the problem? It's just that my car, it has a little personality." And that was the start of a night filled with absurd events. As backup officers arrived, the bright headlights from their patrol cars illuminated the chaotic scene on the road. Broken pieces of the red sedan were scattered everywhere, a part of the bumper, several shards of plastic, and even a piece of the side mirror, all telling a story of a crash that was anything but ordinary. In the middle of the road, a long and deep scratch marked the freshly paved asphalt, leading directly to where the car had collided, a construction barrier. Officer Daniels bent down to inspect the scene, his discomfort evident as he discovered part of the front bumper still attached to the vehicle's license plate. Standing up, he turned back to the swaying woman, who was muttering in frustration. "I didn't hit anything," she screamed, her shrill voice attempting to drown out all other sounds. Daniels raised an eyebrow, holding the piece of bumper as undeniable evidence. "Ma'am, your car is falling apart as if it's shedding its skin," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The woman glared at the officer, her expression one of mock indignation. "Oh, it's old news." "It's been like that for a while," she replied, trying to maintain composure, though her voice and eyes revealed her anxiety. Daniels raised an eyebrow again, looking back at the battered car, now missing a wheel and sporting a badly scratched paint job. "Really? And I suppose this fresh scratch on the road is old news too?" he asked, his voice tinged with irony. "Exactly," she nodded confidently, though nothing in her expression made her words believable. "This car, it has a strong personality. It tends to act unpredictably." Daniels couldn't help but sigh, glancing over at his colleagues who had just arrived. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered a driver trying to make ridiculous excuses, but this level of absurd self-confidence was truly a rarity. During the questioning, the woman seemed to launch into a creative excuse competition, offering a series of bizarre justifications with a confident yet inconsistent tone. "I got hit by some tourists earlier this afternoon. It's definitely their fault. There was a car parked on the side of the road, and it suddenly swerved into me. I couldn't avoid it. That construction barrier, it jumped into my lane. Who could avoid that?" The variety of excuses left the officer dumbfounded, but he remained calm, nodding and taking notes. She even ended with a statement so confidently absurd it was almost hard to believe. "I just wanted to get home, and the tire wasn't cooperating." "But that's not a crime, right?" The officer, who had been suppressing his laughter throughout the conversation, finally couldn't hold it in any longer. "Driving on a rim like fireworks are going off all around you is definitely not legal, ma'am." She frowned, as if the comment were a personal affront. But instead of remaining silent, she continued to justify herself, repeating that she was merely a victim of circumstances. Throughout this time, the officer had to remind her several times that driving a car in such a state was not only dangerous but also a violation of the law. However, she, still in a haze, seemed entirely unaware of the gravity of the situation. Each excuse grew more contradictory when compared with the evidence, and the officer saw clearly that this woman was not only impaired but also extremely determined to avoid taking responsibility. Soon after the swaying car stopped by the roadside, a new character appeared, her rescuer. He was a middle-aged man, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and old flip-flops, his hair disheveled as though he had just been woken up from an unfinished dream. The strong odor of beer, cigarettes, and a hint of personal struggles followed him like an invisible cloud. "What are you doing here?" Officer Daniels asked, his gaze a mixture of interrogation and exasperation. "Ah, she called me about 97 times," he replied, his voice drawn out with no hint of embarrassment. "I thought I should come here before she destroys the entire city." The officer raised an eyebrow, but before he could speak, the man continued, casually pointing at the woman, "Yeah, she's totally smashed." A moment of silence filled the air. Officer Daniels crossed his arms, sighed, and then coldly responded, "Thanks for the honesty." But the man didn't stop. "I'm serious. I told her not to drive, but she said, 'It's only a few miles, my car's fine.'" "Fine? That car's a wreck, worse than my bank account." The officer pointed to his patrol car, cutting off the monologue. "All right, thanks. You can go now." The man shrugged and walked away without a second thought, but still turned around to shout, "Remember to check her high heels." Last time she said they were the cause of the accident. As the man disappeared into the night, Officer Daniels shook his head. "What a reliable support team," he muttered, turning back to continue his frustrating investigation. The signs of the driver's intoxication became more evident with every word and action. Her speech slurred and incoherent, as though every syllable was struggling to escape her mouth. Her answers grew more bizarre, but most notably when she declared with strange confidence, "This is a car for lesbians. It can handle anything." Her words made both the officer and the witnesses laugh, but it wasn't the kind of humor she was hoping for. Faced with increasingly serious questions, she switched from a humorous tone to an irritable attitude. When asked to perform sobriety tests, she initially seemed cooperative, as if trying to prove she hadn't done anything wrong. However, her confidence quickly turned to doubt. Standing by the roadside, she looked around and sighed, as though weighing the pros and cons. "I'm not doing it. These tests are voluntary, right? And voluntary means optional, right?" she said smugly, as if she had just found a perfect legal loophole. The officer, unmoved by her twisted logic, simply raised an eyebrow and waited. Her lack of cooperation not only made the situation more serious but clearly indicated she was trying to avoid the process, hoping that her confusion would undermine the investigation. But this attitude only reinforced suspicions that she had been driving under the influence. When things went too far, the officer had no choice but to act. He quickly signaled for her to turn around. The sound of handcuffs clicking in the night marked the end of her glorious evening. "This is an outrageous injustice," she screamed, her voice a mix of anger and a little drunkenness. "I'm a model citizen. I've never done anything wrong in my life." The officer couldn't help but smirk. He raised an eyebrow and tilted his head toward the battered car behind her. "Oh, of course. Except for crashing into a barrier, shredding the tires, and then trying to turn it into a street performance," he replied coldly, but with a touch of sarcasm. She tried to explain, "I just wanted to go home. Who wouldn't understand that in my situation?" "Oh, I understand," the officer continued, shaking his head as he gently guided her toward the patrol car. "But normally, people check if they still have all four tires before driving home, or, avoid finishing a bottle of wine before getting behind the wheel." She stood still for a few seconds, her dazed eyes gleaming under the police lights. Then she frowned as if she had just come up with something clever. "Do I have the right to call a lawyer?" "I'm sure I have the right." "Of course you do," the officer replied, pushing her into the back of the car. "But first, you'll need to sit in this car, and it's best if you don't argue anymore. That's the only free legal advice you'll get tonight." The sound of the car door slamming shut and the quiet of the night was broken only by the metallic clattering of the wheel rims scattered on the road. The leaves on the trees by the roadside seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the end of this absurd scene. Confronted with the intimidating prospect of a breathalyzer test, the woman hesitated, her bravado teetering on the edge of panic. The officer, now visibly weary from the long exchange, calmly explained the gravity of her decision. Refusal would result in an automatic suspension of her license for 18 months, a harsher penalty due to her documented history of a prior refusal. "You understand the consequences of declining this test, correct?" the officer reiterated, his tone measured but firm. The woman tilted her head, her smirk widening into a self-satisfied grin. "Oh, I comprehend," she replied, drawing out the words as though they were part of a dramatic performance. "But I refuse." Her delivery, accompanied by a mockingly exaggerated nod, gave the impression that she believed she had outmaneuvered the law itself. Her demeanor bordered on theatrical. She folded her arms defiantly, leaned against the patrol car, and tossed a triumphant glance toward the dashboard camera, as if envisioning herself as the star of her own legal drama. To her, this was less about consequences and more about control, a misguided attempt to wrest power from the situation. The officer remained unshaken, patiently repeating the legal implications. "Refusal doesn't negate the charges, ma'am. In fact, it strengthens them. You're now facing not just license suspension but also misdemeanor charges for noncompliance." Unfazed, she shrugged and responded with a flippant, "Well, that's your opinion." The confidence in her tone suggested she hadn't fully grasped the inevitability of her predicament, or perhaps she simply didn't care. The officers exchanged a brief, knowing glance, the kind shared by professionals well versed in dealing with individuals who mistake stubbornness for strategy. As the woman continued her refusal, it became clear that no amount of reasoning would sway her decision. The scene dragged on as she repeated variations of her defiance, each time with a touch more smugness. Her voice carried an almost sing-song quality now, as if she believed her obstinance was a stroke of genius. Little did she realize, each refusal was another nail in the coffin of her legal defense, solidifying her culpability and sealing her fate. In the end, her dramatic refusal wasn't just a rejection of the breath test. It was a masterclass in hubris, a misguided display of entitlement that would cost her far more than she seemed willing to acknowledge. "Maybe it's my blood sugar," she suddenly said, her voice trailing off, as if this was a new discovery. "I might have diabetes." The statement might have seemed reasonable at first, but anyone paying attention would immediately notice the lack of conviction in the way she said it. "Maybe it's my blood sugar," she said, stressing the word maybe, as if she were trying to justify her strange behavior with a reason she wasn't even sure of. Despite trying to maintain her calm, those uncertain, stammered words revealed some of the confusion she was going through. Notably, she didn't claim she had diabetes. She simply said, maybe. That maybe was like a lifeline, a vague hope that the officer and the doctors would sympathize and reduce her charges. When the officer asked, "Do you have diabetes?" his voice was cold, devoid of any sympathy. The question was clear. Was she providing a valid reason for her condition, or just making excuses for her reckless behavior? Her answer was unsurprising. "Well, no. But I might." This response was even weaker, unconvincing. She didn't claim to have the disease, but merely said might, as though this illness was a distant possibility she hadn't even checked. She provided no proof or medical tests to substantiate her claim. The officer didn't show any sympathy. He wasn't falling for her unsupported explanations. What she thought was a reasonable explanation for her erratic behavior didn't convince the officer at all. Instead, he stood firm, not letting himself be swayed by her illogical excuses. The truth was far clearer to him. A person driving under the influence, an accident had occurred, and now she was trying to use a baseless medical excuse to cover up her wrongdoings. This scene reflects a common phenomenon when people with behavioral issues, like drunk driving, try to blame external factors like illness or health conditions to avoid responsibility. While she might indeed have health problems, there was no sign or evidence to support that. Her words only highlighted her dishonesty and attempt to sidestep the main issue, which was driving unsafely under the influence. The officer, calm and professional, was not deceived. He understood that driving while out of control, no matter the reason, required responsibility. And so, no matter what excuse she gave, her story couldn't change the truth. Backed into a corner, she finally admitted it, but not without trying to avoid full accountability. "All right, fine, maybe I hit that barrier. But it's definitely their fault for putting it there." Her voice had a slight hesitancy, but the determination in her words remained unchanged. She was dragged into a situation where every excuse became meaningless, but instead of taking responsibility, she sought to blame her surroundings, trying to push everything out of her control. It was an instinctive defensive tactic from someone on the verge of getting caught, but one that was still full of self-righteousness and lacking self-awareness. Officer Daniels' words rang out like the final shot in a battle, not only legally but also in terms of his patience. The woman, now nothing more than a shadow of someone who had tried to wriggle out of her mistakes, muttered an unrelated phrase, "You're all just jealous of my car." Her words not only revealed her stubbornness but also reflected her utter lack of awareness about the severe consequences she was facing. She still couldn't grasp that this wasn't about her shiny car, but about the reckless behavior of driving under the influence and the irresponsibility of causing an accident. Officer Daniels sighed, his disappointment flickering in his eyes as he gazed at her battered car. He had seen thousands of similar cases: drunk drivers on the streets, ridiculous excuses, and attitudes that could only be described as utter arrogance. But it was undeniable that each case like this left a unique mark on the minds of those in law enforcement. Just another day in the crazy world of roadside justice, Officer Daniels thought as he led the woman to the patrol car. His gaze was filled with fatigue, but also the sharp awareness his job had taught him day by day. In the end, justice had prevailed, but battles like this on the streets had never been easy for him. Ultimately, this story serves as a powerful reminder of the serious consequences that come with being irresponsible behind the wheel. The woman in this tale, despite owning a beautiful car and displaying arrogance, couldn't escape the consequences of driving drunk and refusing to take responsibility. The story illustrates that, while we may have rights and freedom, we must adhere to rules and laws to ensure the safety of ourselves and those around us. When confronted with our mistakes, a humble attitude and a willingness to take responsibility will always lead to redemption and justice, while excuses and arrogance only complicate matters further. The lesson here is, don't let self-satisfaction and lack of control destroy your life and the lives of others.